So I guess we should say this is about Windhover in Hinsdale, at Hinsdale Middle School, I guess it's called. And I'm delighted it's being refurbished. I've had a number of pieces repainted and recited recently, and at UBC, at the University of British Columbia, they've done a beautiful job of fixing up a piece there. It's probably one of my larger pieces. Windhover got its name from a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins that my friend Tony Onley knew about and suggested as a title for the piece. Tony is somebody that I had a studio next door to in San Miguel in Mexico, where I lived after I got out of art school. I didn't read it until shortly after Tony suggested it. It refers directly to a kestrel, a type of a falcon that has an amazing ability to hover. And you see them actually out our door here. Well, Tony and I both had airplanes, and he took to coming to visit me in Canada, where we had a summer home on an island up in the Georgian Bay. And so we liked that kind of image of the bird and a hovering bird, even though a kestrel is not actually a water bird as such. But I was more involved at that point in the sculptures being a metaphor for some particular kind of action, and not to name the sculpture after something else as an illustration. So in other words, the sculpture was itself, it had its own internal logic, and I was a little leery about the idea of naming it Windhover, but I like the word. And Windhover to me has to do with something that might be associated with flight or aviation. So that's why I liked it. However, I noticed that in some of the interpretations of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, that the repetition of planes is also, or in his case, the repetition of words, was also maybe one of the reasons that Tony suggested the word in the first place. It's a series of planes and folds and bends in a single piece of metal that makes it self-supporting, but at the same time, it has its own internal logic. I moved back to Saskatchewan, then eventually to New York. Not long after I moved to New York, I got working with a guy up in New Haven, Connecticut called Don Lippincott, and that's where Windhover was built. And it was one of a number of pieces, including Muskoka was another similar one. That was a series of folded planes, and it was one piece of metal up on its edge, and it was held in place by virtue of the bend in the metal that was done with a big brake press. So Lippincott had a plant in New Haven. He built a lot of my sculpture. He built sculpture for a number of people. Windhover sat in a field outdoors for a number of years. It was shown, I think, once before it went to Hinsdale. But I'd been out to Norman, Oklahoma. So that was 1966, because one of the guys who invited me I'd met at the symposium in Long Beach, California in 65. And I went to Norman, Oklahoma to see a house designed by Bruce Goff. And while I was there, I went out to see what was called the Prairie Chicken House, which was done by a compatriot of his, also part of a school of organic architecture. So I remember Goff's house in particular because we spent time there, but we did drive out to see the Prairie Chicken House as well. It had a similar kind of silhouette to the one that Windhover eventually took. But again, it doesn't illustrate a prairie chicken. And neither does the house, actually. But that's an obvious kind of reference, and it had some bearing on it. And it's a good issue to bring up in terms of the sculpture, is that it represents itself. It doesn't represent anything else. But these are associations that one could relate to the sculpture, because that's the truth of what I was doing before the piece was built. So Lippincott had a much bigger plant than I have as a studio here. But since I moved down here and away from New York, and Don closed his shop, then I don't have the luxury of that kind of arrangement any longer. Although I do work with a couple of fabricators in this area who usually don't do complete pieces but do sections of work for me. So I put all this together after I moved down here from New York, and no longer work directly with as many fabricators as I used to. Or one, in the case of Lippincott, with one fabricator while he was in business. So I used to go from New York, either fly or take the train up to New Haven and work with Don, sometimes 2 or 3 days at a time. And that's where Windhover was built, and that's how we worked. I don't think I've done anything quite as large as, well, maybe a couple of pieces have been as large as Windhover here, but I've had help with the metal forming in particular. Once they're done, I generally move them outside. That's a very early piece there. This one's maybe a little bit more related to Windhover. And then there's another one that's in here for repainting. So probably we can go over by Centra there and photograph the other piece. It was built at Lippincott's as well. And Don brought it down to the first house that we lived in after we moved down here from New York. So this piece here is called Teal. This was built up at Don's. It was part of a series of pieces I did out of what we call Q decking. That was the particular material. And this piece, which was actually a study for our larger piece that Don and I built that went up to Detroit, up to the university in Detroit, and it was what we were trying to do is to make sure that the planes stayed flat after it was formed. So that's why this is such a big model, but it's actually a model for a bigger piece, which you can walk underneath that overhang on the large one. It was commissioned by a guy by the name of Prairie, who was a collector, and he was part of the Prairie seed family, and he was a big benefactor of both the Detroit Art Museum and Wayne State University. This piece is part of an edition. In other words, there's more than one of them, and it was built by Don Lippincott for a gallery in New York called Multiples. And Don gave me part of the edition, and he kept some of the pieces himself, and the rest of them went to the gallery, and they sold them. So this piece is actually, there's versions of this piece all over the place. Although we maybe made 20, I think, something like that. So I gave this one to my wife, to Centra, and built a sculpture base for it, and it can be taken in and repainted every once in a while. The chief is aluminum. This is also aluminum, but Windhover is made out of steel. So this book about my work was done by Jonathan Lippincott, who's Don's son, and his previous book, in fact, was about the Lippincott operation, which was called Large Scale. And I'm delighted that he did this book. It's an excellent book that covers all of my work, and all of these pieces most of these pieces, the earlier ones especially, were done up at Lippincott. But here's Windhover here, where it was originally at Hinsdale, and there is at the plant.